Good evening, everyone, or morning for those who are joining us from Asia. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name is Jonathan Berkshire Miller, and I am Director and Senior Fellow of the Indo-Pacific Program at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, based here in Ottawa. It is my great pleasure today to be your moderator for what I'm sure will be a dynamic and timely discussion on the challenges and opportunities facing the Indo-Pacific region. This session will be focusing in particular on infrastructure development, trade, and the future of economic governance. First of all, I'd like to thank all of our supporters, audience members, and guests today for joining this conversation. We have a real standout cast of speakers to join us this evening from all over the world, joining us from Tokyo, Singapore, Montreal, and Ottawa. This is the second event as a part of MLI's new Canada the Indo-Pacific initiative, which will commit a great deal of our efforts in the coming months to look at this pivotal region and its importance for Canada. We hope you continue to join our future events and read our work on Canada's strategic imperative to understand and organize its engagement in this region. Simply put, infrastructure development is sorely needed in the Indo-Pacific region to sustain growth amongst large and mid-sized economies alike. The Asian Development Bank estimates that more than $25 trillion will be needed by the end of this decade. As the G20 noted under Japan's chair in 2020, infrastructure is a driver of economic prosperity and provides a solid basis for strong, sustainable, balanced, and inclusive growth. Nonetheless, the world still faces a massive gap in financing for investment in new and existing infrastructure, which could generate a serious bottleneck to economic growth and development. The Indo-Pacific region also continues to evolve when it comes to trade and the importance of supply chains. Economic governance and trade are also key measuring sticks for a free and open Indo-Pacific region. The CPTPP, or TPP-11, has now been put in force, and further steps in terms of trade policy are sorely needed to be discussed. In addition to the TPP-11, another regional trade agreement, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, was signed last year. I'm sure our panelists will dive deeper into these issues more today. Importantly, Canada has an opportunity to join the United States, Japan, Australia, European countries, and others in proposing a sustainable trade and investment strategy based on fair lending, transparent institutions, and long-term growth. To shed light on these issues, MLI is delighted to convene this session with a range of regional experts to discuss infrastructure development and trade in the Indo-Pacific, and what role Canada might play in these shifting dynamics. On that note, let me begin by saying we are delighted once again to welcome to our platform Japan's ambassador to Canada, His Excellency Yasuhisa Kawamura. Japan continues to be not only a key friend and partner for Canada in this region, but also an essential proponent of strong economic governance, trade integration, and infrastructure development. I'd like to hand the virtual floor over to Ambassador Kawamura, but before doing so, I'd like to briefly introduce him. Before coming to Canada, Ambassador Kawamura served as ambassador and deputy representative of Japan to the United Nations between 2017 and 2019. He has also served in a range of senior roles in Japan's foreign ministry, including as press secretary and director general for press and public diplomacy. Ambassador Kawamura is also one of Japan's most seasoned diplomats, with overseas postings in New York, Delhi, Indonesia, Brussels, and elsewhere. He continues to be a good friend to me and a strong proponent of strengthening Japan-Canada relations, both on the official track, but also through his robust and keen engagement with public policy institutes such as Macdonald-Laurier Institute, which we are eminently grateful. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. Good evening and good morning, everybody, on and behind the screen. One of the things that I do want to avoid these days is not to start my talk by referring to COVID. But unfortunately, I think I have to start it with COVID again tonight. Looking over the past year, COVID-19 has not only brought health threat to the world, but also accelerated the world division in which the rule-based international order has been challenged. The government of Japan has been emphasizing the importance of multilateralism and leading efforts towards international unity and cooperation in order to realize a world respecting the fundamental values and the rule of law, especially with regard to Japan advocated free and open Indo-Pacific vision. Japan and Canada, which have the Pacific Ocean in between them, share values including the rule of law and free trade, and have been working for the realization of such values, for example, through close collaboration in the G7. In recent years, Japan and Canada strengthened their collaboration both in security and economic areas. For example, through cooperation in monitoring the ship-to-ship transfer, which is illegal in terms of the United Nations Security Council resolution by North Korea, and enacting the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, or CPTPP, as you may know. Our two prime ministers also agreed to enhance our country's strategic partnership under FOIP vision. The Indo-Pacific region accounts for 50% of the world population. The region, which also connects strongly with Africa, has been the center of the world economic growth. The prosperity and stability of the region will have a direct impact on the prosperity and stability of the world. The rise of unilateralism was seen internationally even before the COVID-19 crisis. Facing such a move, Japan realized the importance of enhancing a free trade regime and made an effort to conclude CPTPP with 11 member states in the Indo-Pacific region in 2018. CPTPP is the high standard and well-balanced rule suitable for the 21st century. CPTPP, for example, prohibits non-commercial assistance by state-owned enterprises, which would cause adverse effect or injury to another party, and prohibits data localization requirement for electric commerce. It also includes a strict regulation to address counterfeiting and piracy. CPTPP aims to promote such high standard and well-balanced rules in the Indo-Pacific region and in the world. In that sense, interest shown by many economies in CPTPP are a welcoming move, as it shows CPTPP is highly valued. The government of Japan, as a chair of CPTPP this year, will closely look at such interest of non-member economies. Japan considers it is important to commit to the high standard rules of CPTPP while also securing steady implementation and a possible expansion by taking into account strategic points of view. COVID-19 shut down the global supply chain in its early stages, for example, by export restrictions and border closures. This made the enhancement of a free trade regime and resilient supply chain even more important. As Japanese Prime Minister Suga repeatedly mentions his determination to facilitate economic order based on free and fair rule, even in the COVID era, the government of Japan signed Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement with the UK last October and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, last November with 15 Asia-Pacific countries. RCEP is the Economic Partnership Agreement, which includes countries with different systems and different economic sizes. Although it differentiates itself from CPTPP in its member states, backgrounds, and conditions, it is a meaningful agreement from the standpoint that it includes the rule for intellectual property and electronic commerce. It improves market access for goods and services, and its member states account for 30% of the world trade volume as well as population. In the post-COVID-19 era, where we will see more remote work and digitalization, it is also important to make new rules to create a business environment where cyberspace would be protected and companies would be able to conduct business at ease. Canadian Centre for Cyber Security pointed out in its National Cyber Threat Assessment 2020, the number of cyber threat actors is rising, and state-sponsored actors will almost certainly continue to conduct commercial espionage against businesses, academia, and governments to steal intellectual property and proprietary information. At the G20 Osaka Summit, Japan launched Osaka Track, which aims to promote international rulemaking on digital economy, especially on data flow and electronic commerce. Japan has been working together with partner countries to create the rules based on the concept of data free flow with trust, which is so-called DFFT. For example, by leading discussion in the WTO meeting for exploratory work on electronic commerce as co-conveners. In addition to the rulemaking, it is important to develop hard infrastructure in order to realize resilient supply chain. In the Indo-Pacific region, Japan has been supporting the construction of economic corridors by connecting countries with high-quality infrastructures in order to achieve development in the region as a whole. Since 2018, Japan has been collaborating with the United States and Australia in its support. At the G20 Osaka Summit, G20 Principles for Quality Infrastructure Investment was endorsed. It highlighted the importance of introducing clear rules, a solid system, and good governance, such as openness, transparency, economic efficiency, and debt sustainability in infrastructure investment. Japan considers it is important to work with other countries in the principle of multilateralism for enhancing a free trade regime, resilient supply chains, and creating rules based on DFFT. I look forward to an in-depth discussion in today's webinar, and I hope it will lead to Japan's further cooperation with Canada and other countries in the Indo-Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. I think we can learn a lot from Japan's leadership experience and wisdom on many of these issues. And I think this provides a perfect segue in many ways to some of the topics that we'll discuss today. I think you highlighted a number of them here, looking at Japan's role in the G20, also its role in leadership, which I think sometimes is taken for granted, but getting the TPP 11 across the finish line was a fundamentally difficult thing, and I think Japan's leadership in doing that, and now Canada as a member of that, is a very important element that I think we'll discuss a little bit more today. So thank you very much for those remarks, and I'd like to kind of move forward onto our panel. Another area that I think Japan has been very influential, but other member states, including Canada becoming a founding member, has been very much an important part of this region for a long time, is the Asian Development Bank, which I think doesn't necessarily get as much attention as it should. But on that note, and I should know that he's now retired, so I don't expect him to talk completely on the, as an official from the Asian Development Bank. But we have an expert joining us, Bart Edis, who I'll just briefly introduce. He's a former official for the Asian Development Bank. Currently, he has a number of interesting titles and distinguished titles. He's a distinguished fellow with the Asia-Pacific Foundation here in Canada. He's also has a affiliation with CSIS in Washington, D.C. And he's the author of a book called Learning from Tomorrow, Using Strategic Foresight to Prepare for the Next Big Disruption, which I think is extremely timely, Bart. So I know that that's a book that's going to be on my list to read this year as well. So Bart, happy to have your remarks, please.
Jonathan, thank you very much. And I do want to talk about the role of the multilateral development banks, including the one I just worked at for the last 20 years, the Asian Development Bank. But I first want to make a couple of points leading into that. The first one concerning Canada's trade. I mean, most of those online and tuning in today are in Canada or have a keen interest in Canadian trade and economic relations. So I want to talk a bit about diversification of Canada's trade and investment, and how that, as a second point, leads to Asia. And then I'll talk a bit about the MDBs, and I'll be rather succinct given we've got a panel to go through. So on the first point of diversification, as many of the listeners, those tuning in today know, about 70% of Canada's trade is with the United States. Canada is very dependent on the U.S. economy, and it kind of makes sense. The markets are heavily integrated, especially, for example, in the automotive sector. And frankly, for a lot of Canadian business, especially smaller and medium-sized enterprises, it's quite comfortable having such a large market, speaking English, geographically close right next door. But in the last 4 years, there's been a bit of a wake-up call about that kind of dependence. In August, just not that long ago, you had the U.S. administration saying that Canadian imports from Canada of aluminum were threatening to impair the national security of the United States. And then you had a change of administration quite recently, and one of the first things it did was cancel the Keystone XL pipeline and announce measures to promote procurement of U.S.-made goods and services. So this kind of comfort that's existed for many years of having a huge market right next door, with that comfort comes risk. And so the second point I really wanted to make was that in looking to get beyond reliance on one major market, Canada needs to move more aggressively toward pursuing opportunities in large and growing markets. And these markets are, for the most part, in Asia. You have government agencies at the federal and provincial level, like the Trade Commissioner Service, frankly, doing a great job. They're really working closely with business to identify opportunities and promote Canadian business abroad. But it hasn't really moved the needle that much thus far. When we think of Asia in terms of markets, oftentimes China comes to mind because it is such a large economy and continues to grow. In fact, it's one of the few economies in Asia and the world that grew on a net basis in 2020 in the midst of the pandemic. But it's not the only one. Vietnam and Taiwan, for example, those economies also grew in 2020. One of the things I'm watching in terms of looking beyond China for opportunities in Asia are the plans of the Canadian Pension Plan Investment Board. So the board manages some 430 billion Canadian dollars worth of pensions assets. And much of the investments that it carries out are in North America. Outside of Canada, the leading destination is perhaps obviously the US, but after the US, it's Asia. And it's interesting to note that between now and 2025, the Pension Plan Investment Board plans to make 1/3 of its investments in emerging markets, in particular in India, including in infrastructure, in real estate, and in public and private equities. I know that Yuka on the panel will talk a bit more about Japan, but let's also mention Korea. Korea was the first country Canada had a free trade agreement with going into effect in 2015. And just a couple of weeks ago, we had a major announcement of the Korean tech giant Naver, kind of a Google plus within the Korean market, buying Wattpad, a social storytelling platform catering to the Gen Z generation, a $600 million investment from Korea in Canada. And if we look to Southeast Asia, to the 10 ASEAN countries, this is a massive market, 670 million people, booming middle class, 60% of the people there are under the age of 35. The top 5 developing countries in ASEAN grew about 5% a year in the last decade, 2010 to 2019. And by 2030, ASEAN is expected to be the 4th largest economy in the world. So one of the smart things that Canada has done recently, and the ambassador referred to this, was joining the CPTPP. And it was because of Japan's leadership in large part that this agreement came into being, and Canada joined early on. And 4 of the countries that are signatories, that are participants in this major agreement, are in ASEAN. And it's heartening to see that Canada is talking about a possible free trade agreement with ASEAN. And right now, the government is consulting on a potential Canada-Indonesia comprehensive economic partnership agreement. So this takes me to the multilateral development banks, which work in many of these countries. It was, Jonathan, you mentioned at the outset this big infrastructure need in Asia. And ADB itself has estimated that the annual need for infrastructure investments is about 1.7 trillion US dollars. This is between 2016 and 2030. So each year that's the need. And only about half of that is currently being met. And almost all of it, 90%, is from the public sector, including monies that some of the governments borrow from institutions like the one I used to work for, ADB. And when we talk infrastructure, we're thinking, for example, of water, of IT, of energy, of transport. Now, of the overall investment in infrastructure taking place, the multilateral development banks like ADB were financing about 2.5% a handful of years ago. If you take China and India out of the equation, it rises to 10%. And that sounds like a very small amount, and in a way it is, but the MDBs also lead by example. And the example they're leading by, for example, is providing very high standards and due diligence, well in line with the principles, the Osaka principles that the ambassador referred to. So taking seriously social and economic and environmental and governance aspects of projects. So, and also the debt standing of countries so as not to overload them with debt. So ADB and other actors, other multilateral development banks, and I point to the World Bank Group, the EBRD, which works in some of the former Soviet republics in Central Asia and the Caucasus, and the newer Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB. They are all playing a key role in providing sovereign loans to governments for infrastructure, but also they have private sector wings that are promoting private sector investment, which is really what's going to be needed to address this large gap. And I know in the case of ADB, it's greatly ramped up its work in the private sector. We've hired more staff. And you also see in the last couple of years, the IFC, the private sector wing of the World Bank Group, has received a capital increase, and some of that is being directed to Asia as well. And just to wind up, I want to mention Canada's role in all of this. So Canada is a founding member of ADB, of the World Bank, and of the EBRD, and it joined the AIIB within 2 or 3 years of the start of that new institution. At ADB, Canada is number 7 in terms of shareholding out of 68 countries. And in the last 8 years has contributed over 300 million Canadian dollars to a number of special funds that are addressing climate change and promoting private sector investment to address adaptation and mitigation, and also disaster risk management. So Canada has played a big role in ADB. It's also been active in some of these other development banks I'm talking about. Again, with the focus on ADB, since Canada joined at the outset in the mid-1960s, Canadian consultants, individuals and companies have won some 400 contracts for consulting and procurement worth some 170 US dollars. And so I'll just conclude by saying Canada is in there. They're in the develop, both directly and in through these multilateral development banks that are upholding high standards of infrastructure investment, which the region desperately needs. It can do more. In the case of ADB, it's not individual consultants and procurement providers are not winning as many contracts as they could. If they look beyond North American continent and spend a little more time investing in Asia and taking advantage of government support programs and advice, they could have a bigger impact. And outside of the development banks, Canada could be teaming up more closely with Japan, with Australia, India, and the US in partnerships. You have, for example, the US proposal for a Blue Dot network, a certification scheme for infrastructure. It's not clear whether this will continue with the new administration, but in any case, there are various initiatives and funding programs, for example, in the energy sector, promoting investment in Southeast Asia and beyond, and Canada can play a bigger role in all this. Thank you, Jonathan.
Well, thank you, Bart. I mean, that was there's a lot of great information there to kind of distill on and to think about. And I think we'll kind of get a little bit to more of that during the moderated questions. But just very quickly, I mean, I thought you made a lot of excellent points. So one of the things I hadn't considered as much, you know, I like the fact that you underscored that there's a lot that we can do within the Asian Development Bank, but also with the World Bank Group and the EBRD. I think that's interesting. I think when people think of the region, they tend to think in terms of the Asian Development Bank and the new AIIB, but the idea that other more established players could also play a role there is very crucial. And I think I also like your overarching point, which has been a kind of a driver of our institute as Canada and the Indo-Pacific Initiative is the idea that when we look at this region, it's broader than just Canada's engagement with China. Of course, China is a big market. There are opportunities there. There are risks there, as we know, but there are many, many other players in this region outside of China. I think that the ambassador obviously highlighted some of the benefits that Japan's providing to this region. I think you referenced Korea, and I think ASEAN is very crucial. And I think it's a nice segue to Amitendu, actually, because if we think about some of the key trade agreements that are established now in this region, sometimes I think the TPP, before it became an 11-member group, was seen as a US deal. And I think the RCEP often is seen as a China deal. But I think Amitendu knows very well that these are ASEAN origin, ASEAN focused deals that obviously involved at one point or other the big players. I think India was involved in RCEP until it decided it didn't want to be involved in RCEP. But I think it's important to remember that point, that ASEAN is central to both of these trade establishments. So this will segue us to our next panelist, who is Amitendu Palit, a great friend of mine, and he's a senior research fellow and research lead at the Institute of South Asian Studies in the National University of Singapore, which I had a great pleasure to visit. I believe it was last year, or time seems to have flown by so quickly now in the COVID era. But he has a great institute there in Singapore. And Amitendu also has a number of other roles and experiences. Most notably, he's spent several years in the Ministry of Finance in the government of India. So he has both the perspective from being on the ground now in the ASEAN region, but also his long history of working in the Indian bureaucracy on trade and development issues. So Amitendu, I'll give the floor to you, please.
Thank you, Jonathan. A pleasure to be with you all today. And it's a great pleasure, actually, to be in a part of this conversation with the MLI. Thank you for inviting me to share the views. I think what I heard from my previous colleagues on the panel till now, both Ambassador Kawamura as well as Bert, have very clearly articulated the specifics that are driving the core granular issues involved in the subject that we are discussing today. So building up from there, they have alluded to the specific trade developments that have taken place in the region, the CPTPP, the RCEP. They have alluded to a series of developments that have come into the larger matrix of conversation around the Indo-Pacific today. I would like to bring to the table a few distinct points which I think are going to influence the way infrastructure shapes in this part of the world. And when I say in this part of the world, I do have primarily Asia on my mind, but I am trying to focus on it from a Canadian vantage point of view. I think one of the important changes that we need to note when we talk about infrastructure in Asia, and particularly from an outsider perspective, is that the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean and the region that they encompass is an extremely heterogeneous region when it comes to capacities. And Bert alluded to this in a specific way, and his experience with the Asian Development Bank, he knows better than probably all of us, that the capacities with respect to infrastructure are very diverse across the region. And we have very, very, I would say, challenging perspective when it comes to addressing the infrastructure deficits in the region. And this, to a very large extent, had focused the way multilateral institutions and even individual country governments would address the issue of infrastructure. The focus was largely internal, and to a specific extent, it led to external engagements around the specific neighborhoods of countries, like, say, for example, within the Southeast Asia region, or even within parts of Southeast Asia. Countries like Myanmar, Vietnam, Laos would look at infrastructure development or internal integration within them in a way which was somewhat different from countries like Malaysia or Indonesia, and of course Singapore, which were ahead in terms of institutional capacities. But this perspective has become a bit clouded of late because there has been a shift in the way infrastructure development is being addressed these days. The focus has moved on from traditional infrastructure capacities to the modern infrastructure capacities. And what I mean by the distinction between the two of them is that probably 7 to 8 years ago, the question of cyber connectivity, the question of digital integration between markets and communities was not as prominent in the region or in the Indo-Pacific as it is today. Because today, there's a clear realization that has come up that while land connectivity is important, but perhaps maritime connectivity is that much more important for a number of economies. But even more than maritime connectivity, perhaps economic benefits can be well and truly realized if the countries are connected through a cyber network, enabling greater inflow and outflow of cross-border transactions and exchanges. And to that extent, it's no longer easy for countries to actually focus on all elements of infrastructure development. They have to prioritize, and this is where the role of a country like Canada, which looks at building engagement, investment opportunities with the Indo-Pacific, becomes squarely important, because I think it's also important for Canada to prioritize in terms of what are the areas of infrastructure and in which of the countries does it intend to engage. To give you an example, there is a very interesting development that has happened in the region, which brings certain countries from across the Asia-Pacific. This is called the Digital Economic Partnership Agreement, which is taken off between Singapore, Brunei, and Chile, three small economies of the Asia-Pacific, all of them, interestingly, part of the comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership that was alluded to earlier. Now, what this probably means is that while countries are willing to become part of big trade agreements, humongous trade agreements, in order to benefit from the common rules of origin and trade facilitation which these agreements allow them, they're also willing to engage in much more selective spaces on specific issues. And let's say, for example, with respect to the digital economy, that would clearly enable them to focus on areas of cutting-edge advantage. Now, if one looks at this in the context of a higher demand for modern infrastructure, 21st century new generation infrastructure, then one also needs to note the fact that this realization has led to a distinct geopoliticization of the perspective of infrastructure in the region. This first happened with the emergence of the Belt and Road Initiative. There was no initiative which focused on this new generation focus on infrastructure connectivity in the region as prominently as the Belt and Road Initiative did. Now, once the Belt and Road Initiative brought the entire question of modern infrastructure and greater connectivity on the table, there were responses that came up. And these responses were articulated primarily through the United States in its Asia Reassurance Initiative Act that President Trump articulated in terms of the US vision of the Indo-Pacific, which also talks about rather in a focused and pointed fashion on the importance of investing in modern infrastructure, cutting-edge infrastructure, which really consolidates the ability of businesses to capture more dividends from knowledge-intensive areas. But the problem over here is that once countries step into this game, the question of national security also becomes prominent. Like, say, for example, on telecom infrastructure, which is an integral part of the digital infrastructure and cyber connectivity that countries and the regions are looking for. The question of national security can no longer be disconnected. And that then leads to another set of complications when countries start getting together on the question of common data rules or trade rules. Because while they understand the importance of coming together on this subject, they also understand the risks which greater integration creates in this regard. And that is the big challenge which this region is having to grapple with right now, which has been further complicated by COVID-19. Because what COVID-19 has brought on for the countries is very interesting. COVID-19 has made it very clear that this pandemic or similar pandemics in future cannot be handled in isolation. It's important for countries to cooperate. And when it comes to cooperation, the cooperation is not just in terms of having similar strategies with respect to the public health systems, but most importantly, in terms of sharing information on how the pandemic is progressing, what's happening with respect to the development of vaccines, how these are being administered. And now that today the vaccines have become available, countries across Indo-Pacific have begun immunizing their population. The biggest challenge that has come up for the region is how to effectively create a logistics infrastructure that will enable the vaccines to move from one part of the region to another seamlessly. And most of it has to be integrated with the digital infrastructure capacities that the countries in the region have, because COVID-19 vaccine movement has to be seamless, has to be fast, and has to be effective. And in a number of cases, countries with low digital capacities are unable to handle this challenge. Now, this is again something where a country like Canada needs to actually visualize what's happening on ground, and probably it can have an extremely important constructive role to play as vaccine game develops and as Canada's capacity in terms of looking closely at the region, in terms of the trade agreements, come on force. What I think I would further mention in two of my last points is it's very interesting that along with COVID-19, along with geopoliticization of the infrastructure rush, Asia Pacific and countries of Indo-Pacific at large, and particularly those which are part of Asia, has not actually given up on trade as compared with the Atlantic part of the world, where a large number of trade restrictions and export restrictions came up in the wake of COVID-19. Export restrictions in Asia have been much few, and by and large, Southeast Asia and the region has remained committed to a free trade agenda, and that is clearly visible from the passage of the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. That is clearly visible from standalone bilateral trade agreements that have either been finished or are being worked upon, like, say, for example, the UK-Japan Partnership Agreement, the EU-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement, and the various agreements that ASEAN is engaged with, and finally the CPTPP. Now, today, the CPTPP presents a host of exciting possibilities, particularly when one looks at it in the background of the fact that there is a new United States administration. That administration might want to recommit itself to the CPTPP. But in the meantime, a number of substantive geopolitical changes have taken place in the region, which have actually included a country like China, which previously looked at CPTPP with a great degree of suspicion, now expressing an interest to join the CPTPP. And there have also been occasions where Taiwan has expressed an interest to join the CPTPP. So it's going to be a very interesting but complicated way of looking at trade. But what I wanted to end on with is the fact that while there are these very major shifts that have taken place in the perspective towards infrastructure building in the region, and while there have been trade activities that have gone on in terms of institutional trade agreements, the point that we must note very carefully is that there's a great degree of radical reordering which is happening in Asia. And that's primarily in terms of the repositioning of supply chains. Ambassador Kawamura alluded to the resilient supply chain initiative which Japan, China, and Australia have taken up. There are also other similar focuses that are going on in terms of making the regional supply chains less prone to disruption and widening the basket of procurement for individual countries. But I think it's important to note that to a very large extent, this is a push coming from a geopolitical perspective. There is a geopolitical urge to fix this push and take the production out of China to the extent possible. Now, there is a certain geopolitical rationale to it because there is this sentiment, this anxiety that China has been consistently weaponizing the economic interdependence it has with a large number of countries in the region, including with the rest of them. But the question is Is this a sentiment which is also shared by businesses? I think that's the key point which will drive the future focus on infrastructure, investment, and trade relationships in the region. Does the geopolitical perspective lead to a similar enthusiasm on part of business, particularly private business? Because a country like Canada will need to bring that on the table to its investors and check with them whether this consistently converges between two sides of the spectrum, the political side and the business side. I'll end here.
Well, thank you so much, Amitandu. I think there's a lot of great points there to think on. In particular, I think it was very interesting that you brought up the digital economics side, which I think is going to be very, very important, and I think is a good segue to our next panelist. And I think the other really important point you brought on was the importance to work together, and how this interconnects with the digital side in the post-COVID-19 world. So I think both of these points were very important. And one thing I think that we can kind of connect a little bit more on question time is the importance that when we think about countries that we should be engaging in, and particularly I'm thinking about Canada in this regard. I think you referenced ASEAN, but you also noted the particular bilateral countries that would provide opportunities for us. And within those bilateral countries, what would be the specific sectors or areas? I think that's very important to kind of think a little more granularly on where our interests are, where our strengths are. So those are all great points. I'd like to move on now to our next panelist, who is coming to us from Tokyo, Miss Yuka Koshino. Yuka is a research fellow right now for Japan Security and Defense Policy with the International Institute for Strategic Studies. She's one of Japan's best emerging scholars on the sort of intersection between national security and economic governance issues, economic statecraft issues. Before joining IISS and the Japan chair there, she was at another Japan chair with the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Yuka, we're delighted to have you, and please.
Thank you very much for a very kind introduction, Jonathan, and for inviting me to this online event on a very important topic. I feel grateful and honored to join such a distinguished group of experts today and to speak after Ambassador Kawamura's excellent and very comprehensive and informative speech on Japan's approach to regional connectivity in the Indo-Pacific region. So unlike the other speakers, I am not an economist or I don't have experience in development financing, but today I hope to contribute to the discussion by focusing on the security and the strategic dimension of regional connectivity, with a focus on digital infrastructure and digital economy as well, and to discuss why there's a growing need for like-minded partners like Japan and Canada to cooperate in promoting net connectivity with rules-based liberal order in the Indo-Pacific region. I have three very brief points today for my opening remarks. So my first point is that the Indo-Pacific region is the engine of global economy in the 21st century, like Amitandu has just described, and is becoming increasingly so as the world's fastest growing digital economy. The region has the fastest growing digital population, driven by the young digital native population. And the region is also rapidly digitalizing its economy and society by adopting technologies brought about by the fourth industrial revolution, like 5G, artificial intelligence, big data, and IoT and robotics, to meet its economic and social development goals. And the region is also driving the digital innovation because of that. My second point is that we still see gaps in governance, rules, and norms in digital space. And that is why the digital infrastructure in the Indo-Pacific region, which will serve as the important backbone of this future global economy, has become the center of geopolitical competition between China and the United States. Most importantly, Chinese digital technologies like 5G and e-commerce and payment systems and smart cities have rapidly spread across the region under President Xi Jinping's Digital Silk Road project, which is the digital dimension of the Belt and Road Initiative that has become increasingly apparent over the last several years. providing, and these developed through the government's provision of massive funding supports and regulatory supports. And this raises security, economic, and political concerns for Japan, Canada, and like-minded countries. Chinese firms' links, for example, with the state through the Chinese intelligence law raises questions over the security and reliability of this very important digital backbone of the economy. And unfair lending practices undermines the rules-based, free, open, and fair economic order and competition in the region. And the spread of Chinese technologies is also spreading the Chinese model of a more of an authoritarian taste of the governance, raising questions around data protectionism or democratic values and even human rights abuses through the spread of massive state surveillance technologies. My final point is that Japan, the United States, or any other countries, like-minded countries, cannot meet these challenges alone. And the free and open Indo-Pacific vision, which Ambassador have laid out in great detail, has already served and has developed into a very useful economic construct, inclusive construct over the past years to mobilize the like-minded countries to respond to these challenges through a rules-based approach. Digital connectivity, for instance, is a key pillar of this free and open Indo-Pacific vision proposed by Japan, and also shared under the shared visions of the free and open Indo-Pacific between the United States and Japan. And as the ambassador has mentioned, Japan's also launched the Osaka track to promote the rules making in the field of e-commerce through the concept of the DFFT. And also, if you look at the region, Australia, India, and Southeast Asia have also embraced the principles of the free and open Indo-Pacific, although maybe the countries might not be exactly using the phrase FOIP. More importantly, countries beyond the region, like have begun to uphold this approach, such as United Kingdom and France and Germany and Netherlands have all launched this free Indo-Pacific policies embracing these principles. And while there were questions about the longevity of this FOIP under the leadership transitions over the past several months, for instance, in Japan, the Prime Minister Suga has committed, as soon as he assumed office, to continue the FOIP and committed to the region as an Indo-Pacific nation during his first foreign visits to Vietnam and Indonesia last year. And there is also increased opportunity and momentum for U.S. leadership role in upholding rules-based economic order in the region. The new Biden administration senior officials over the past several days have agreed to cooperate under the free and open, to achieve a free and open Indo-Pacific with the Japanese counterpart. And it is more willing to take part in regional multilateral forums, such as the East Asia Summit, which the Trump administration has often skipped during his presidency. So with the absence of a U.S. leadership role to fill in the gap over the past several years under the Trump administration, and the regional and China's increasing willingness to take on that leadership role to shape the governance and roles and norms in this region, there is a growing importance for cooperation between like-minded partners like Canada and Japan to play in this region in the world. So I very much look forward to continuing the discussion today. And thank you very much again for inviting me.
Well, thank you so much, Yuka. That's very interesting discussion on Japan's approach to FOIP, but also the intersection with digital connectivity. And I think you brought up a really important point at the end when talking about multilateral architecture and why, while it's a necessary kind of condition, it's not always a sufficient condition. And I think this is something that myself and others, I think at the Institute, have argued that there are many different ways, many different vehicles of engagement that I think like-minded states will need to be driving to pursue their interests on this area. And I think the current multilateral architecture is one of them. But I think working together with like-minded countries, and Japan obviously being one of the first and foremost in my mind, will be an important element. So thank you very much. And I'm sure we'll talk more at question time. So I'd like to kind of now bring to our last panelist, and last but definitely not least is our Canadian friend here, Dan Ciuriak. And Dan has many affiliations and roles. I think you have more than my baseball card set when I was a kid. But it's a testament to what an authority Dan is on trade, investment, and finance issues. Just to kind of list off a couple, he is director and principal of Ciuriak Consulting Incorporated. He's a senior fellow with the Center for International Governance Innovation in Waterloo, in addition to being a fellow at C.D. Howe Institute in Toronto, along with the Asia-Pacific Foundation in Vancouver, and the BKP, Development Research and Consulting Institute in Munich, Germany. So Dan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Are you hearing me well?
Yes, we can hear you great.
Perfect. So thank you very much, first of all, for the opportunity to be on this panel. And of course, after the great presentations by Ambassador Kawamura, Bart, and Amitendu, and Yuka, I don't feel like I'm hitting cleanup. I think I'm adding a few footnotes to what they've already laid on the table, but I'll try and add a little bit to it. I would focus on underscoring two particular risks. There are two things which are moving big time right now. One of them is economic geography, and the other one is technology. So with the CETA and the CPTPP and the CUSMA in place, we could think of Canada as being in the center of gravity of the world trading system, safely embedded in a multilateral framework in which goods were, quote unquote, made in the world by global value chains. But the Indo-Pacific framing, which is actually at the heart of a broader re-emergence of an Afro-Eurasian trading system, which was the dominant system prior to the industrial era, and which is centered on East Asia, things feel a bit different. Canada does not have trade agreements with the three large population, high growth economies in this system, which is China, India, and the ASEAN 10. As Bart said, the US is looking inward now. Japan, which anchors the CPTPP, is now part of RCEP, which draws it west and south for production links and markets. Meanwhile, the European Union is looking east with its investment agreement with China. And this is actually accentuated by the splintering caused by Brexit, because the UK, which is Canada's largest trading partner in the EU, is now outside and looking west to the United States. So in economic geography terms, the economic tectonic plates are moving, and Canada is now starting to look distant from the world's center of gravity. And we tend to mention that we have to revisualize our place in the world. And I think this is a very important thing for us to absorb and reflect upon. The second major risk is concerns technology. So the trade agreements that we have made were optimized for an era shaped by the industrial knowledge-based economy era. This is the world of global value chains. Since around 2010, we have entered the data-driven economy era. And this is the result of key technological breakthroughs in the 2000s, the introduction of the iPhone, which triggered the mobile era and an explosion of data, breakthroughs in neural net technology, and the application of massively parallel computer chips to optimize these neural nets. And this resulted in the powering of artificial intelligence through machine learning. So make no mistake, we are in a very new technological era. The digital transformation that this is powering is now moving very swiftly, and it's accelerated by the pandemic. So what does this mean for Canada? Well, in the first instance, there are no oceans or littorals in cyberspace. Canada is not necessarily now outside of this system and the new antipodes to the new Afro-Eurasian or Indo-Pacific system. The trade agreement that may be most critical for Canada going forward may be the DIPA, as Amitendu emphasized. But there are major issues to be addressed in keeping the flow of data going. Free flow with trust, as per the G20 proposal that was developed during Japan's year as chair of the G20, is threatened by national security and sovereignty concerns. The DIPA actually is very thin in terms of how to regulate, how to deal with this economy. The infrastructure that shapes connectivity in digital space is undersea cables and satellites. And these systems are now subject to fragmentation along security lines. So we have, China has its Baidu system, the US has GPS, the Europeans have the Galileo system. And when we think about the undersea cables, the major powers are moving to exclude each other from laying them because they want to be certain about the security of the flow of information through these cables. So Canada's disadvantages in this particular new economy are we have no production capacity, particularly in the hardware side of the economy. We really miss Nortel. The second thing is that the digital economy is a world of superstar firms. And these are now concentrated in Northeast Asia. China, with 126 Fortune 500 firms, is now actually more than the United States. And then there's Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. All of them are major centers for these large firms. These draw energy and scale from the integrated Northeast Asian economy, and RCEP will work to further deepen these networks. So technological decoupling, which is raised by the security side, could cripple our ability to gain a foothold in the digital economy of the future. By the way, in today's news, I see that US firms are voicing the same fear. So whether Canada's economic and trade strategy, Wayne Gretzky, a famous Canadian hockey player, once famously said, the secret was to move to where the puck was going. Well, we have technological and economic geographic tectonic plates are moving. We need to move towards the new center of gravity. We have to visualize how we fit in the world. And this will take us, as a number of speakers have said before me, towards prioritizing our linkages, in particular, right in the first instance to ASEAN, which seems the most promising market for a new free trade agreement. But in general, Canada has to find its way in the digital economy space in this brave new world of the future. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks very much, Dan. I think those are really helpful comments and really kind of helps us circle this conversation. I think it complemented very well with Yuka's remarks. And just a couple points before we kind of get to the moderated discussion. But I think it's really important to kind of talk about some of the disruptive technologies, but also some of the, as you said, the new economy, and I think our need to adapt. And a couple of points on the regional side, I think that, and this sort of, I think, was reinforced by a couple of your prior panelists, was the need for us to think not only beyond Northeast Asia, where I think, we have important relationships in Northeast Asia. I think there's 2 points here. We need to think, I wouldn't say it's just moving from Northeast Asia to Southeast Asia. I think it's within Northeast Asia. I think we need to be thinking a little bit differently too. And I noticed yourself and Bart and others had referenced working more closely with Taiwan and South Korea, and obviously Japan has been brought up. So I think that this is not to say that we shouldn't look for opportunities to engage with China, but I think all of the panelists brought up the point that I think there's a bigger piece of pie and potentially much more easier partners to work with in that region that we should be looking at, in addition to strengthening our ties with countries in ASEAN and India. So a great set of remarks. So I'd like to move on now quickly to the moderated discussion part of this panel. And the way I think that I'm going to run this is I'm going to, I have a couple questions that I have on my mind. And everyone is happy to, and welcome to kind of chime in on them. But I think I'm going to focus them more on one or two panelists here. And then if others have comments, you can just grab my attention and you can kind of, if we were live, you could give me the 2-finger kind of sign. But just feel free to kind of grab my attention and you can kind of chime in as well. So the first question that I have, and I think I'm going to direct this towards Bart initially. This will be looking at sort of the institutional side and especially on infrastructure. So you discussed, in a very positive light, and I think you were able to articulate this quite well about the role of the ADB and also the World Bank Group and EBRD. I fully agree that the ADB should be playing a central role as we develop our approach to infrastructure in the Indo-Pacific. I think it's been underappreciated in many ways. But what other sort of, in addition to some of the things that Canada could be doing, the ADB and other countries that are members of the ADB could be doing, what other, outside of the kind of multilateral groups that you mentioned, what other ways could there be to kind of complement the ADB's work? And is there kind of space and capacity to do that? So I think a few people brought up the Blue Dot Network. Australia, US, and Japan have a trilateral infrastructure collaboration project. Are there ways that you feel that we could be better at complementing the work of the ADB?
Jonathan, thanks for the question. A couple of thoughts on that. The first is, look, Canada is a land of immigration, and I think it's becoming increasingly clear that this is a huge national asset for the country. There are some, for example, 6 million Canadians with Asian roots. Now, some, they've been here many generations, their families, others are more recently arrived. And many of them have maybe a more entrepreneurial bent, have started businesses and connected back to their homelands and regions. And I don't get the feeling that we've fully, these diaspora networks have been fully utilized, harnessed, this power of connectivity across cultures that also links into business opportunities. So that's one that comes to mind. What more can be done? And I think, if you look at the immigration trends, COVID threw everything off. But up until COVID, you had large incoming groups from the Philippines, from India. Of course, China's there too. But how can, through chambers of commerce and giving a greater attention to these groups, can we link into the countries in Asia? So that's one thought. And related to that, I'll just make one other point, is Canada, again, before COVID interrupted, continued to increase the number of foreign students in Canada. And then at the university level, many students who come, they get a degree and then they stay on for a handful of years. And many of them will then get permanent residency and stay. And they're adding to the human capital in an aging population. And they're contributing to ingenuity, creativity, well-educated. And many of them are getting into the startup sectors of Toronto, Edmonton, Ottawa, Montreal, Vancouver, and elsewhere. So this is a trend we should not stop from a Canadian perspective. And at the same time in the US, again, pre-COVID and during COVID, you had more restrictions and kind of a feeling that we don't welcome students in the way that we used to. And the doormat, the door wasn't quite as open as it was in the past. This is a comparative advantage for Canada, and there's many ways from the students to immigrant populations to tap into that and connect through businesses. It is happening, of course, it's happening. But I'm just saying, what more can we do to ratchet that up? And I think this is going to be a very powerful strength of Canada.
Thanks so much, Bart. Did anybody else want to chime in on the infrastructure question? Or if you do, just wave your hand, or I can move on to my next question. Okay, Yuka, please.
Thank you. Maybe I can add several comments around what kind of institutions we might be able to consider in terms of infrastructure financing. I think I just wanted to maybe elaborate a little bit on the roles of public and private infrastructure financing institutions. That's increasingly playing a role, especially around digital connectivity. First is, I think there were a lot of mentions about the trilateral US, Japan, Australia infrastructure partnership and the Blue Dot network. But I think what's really opening up opportunities is the new the US International Finance Development Corporation, which has doubled its investment cap under the BUILD Act, and also allows non-US firms to provide loans to non-US firms. And this is, I think, is a very important change under the new legislation and increased capacities. And the cooperation between Japan's Bank of International Cooperation, JBIC, and is allowing a large level of financing for infrastructure. And also another aspect, so Japan has been funding a lot of projects with the United States and Australia around the undersea cables. And the recent example is Chile's decision to go with Japan's the proposal, and which includes JBIC and US DFC. But also Japan has this tool specifically focused on ICT. It's called the Japan ICT Fund, which is also a private and public investment fund for digital infrastructure, which has been playing a key role in Japan's undersea cable projects around the Indo-Pacific region, and also the recent other cases include investments in Palau's digital undersea cables in the Pacific Islands. So I think there's a lot of roles that these private and public funds can play in enhancing digital connectivity.
Jonathan, if I could just weigh in very quickly. It should be explored. And keep in mind that Canada also has a development finance institution that was set up in the last handful of years, FinDev Canada. It's much, much smaller than the DFC in the US. It's, in terms of its capitalization. It's based in Montreal, where I am. And it was set up with a focus, initially at least, on Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean. And I understand the reasons that was done, and there's some good strategic reasons with limited capital. But if we are looking at these big markets in Asia, which are going to become so much more important in the next few years, should not this agency be beefed up like the DFC south of the border to help Canadian firms get into Asian markets? That would be my observation.
That's a really good point, Martin. And one thing I was going to kind of notice too, I mean, I had noticed the growing collaboration. As you said, it's still a nascent sort of institution, but I believe there's an MOU signed with DFC. And I think this is, as we continue to kind of build our approach to this region, I think they should be a key partner that we think about. Yuka, you brought up a range of important kind of topics. I think undersea cables as well was something that has been discussed. Dan discussed this as well. And I think this is an important element. And it's a good segue, unless anyone else has any other sort of points to talk a bit on the trade side, because I think some of the things that the US has been doing in infrastructure terms, which I think started under the Trump administration, but I think likely many elements will continue to be followed under the Biden administration, I think help broaden out its approach to this region. I think sometimes when the Obama administration initially came out with its pivot, it was framed as seemingly largely a security leg. But I think that we've seen increased attention towards infrastructure and other elements. So this is, I think, an important factor. Let me move on to my next kind of question, and I'm going to start, Amitendo, with you on this. And this is going to be more centered on trade. And I guess as I was mentioning the U.S., I'm going to give you the very, very difficult question and ask you, will the U.S. rejoin the Trans-Pacific Partnership? What do you see the prospects of that? Just because I want to be an unhelpful moderator. But before asking you that question, and others are free to chime in on that, I wanted to talk more broadly and more strategically about some of the multilateral trade agreements that are developing in the region. We touched on both the CPTPP and RCEP, but there are other more ambitious projects, FTAP and others, that have been kind of discussed over the years, in addition to the bilaterals and the Japan-ASEAN deals and other sorts of the layers of FTAs in the region. How do you see the sort of the future of this sort of trade architecture in the region? And if you could, particularly in addition to the U.S. and thinking about if they will or they won't join the Trans-Pacific Partnership, does expansion make sense? And if so, what partners does expansion of CPTPP make sense in regards to? So, Amitendo, please. I think you're on mute. Sorry, Amitendo. Oh, I think you're still on mute, but maybe we can canvass if anybody else has any predictions on whether the U.S. is going to join the TPP while Amitendo figures out his mic. Anybody? Okay, Bart.
Sorry, no, it's not going to happen. The U.S. administration has made clear what its focus is on in the next couple of years, when it really has to cap the capital, and before elections of 2022 may swing the House or the Senate back in the Republican hands. And trade is not a high priority. And joining the CPTPP, it's too big a lift, given opposition on both the right and the left, the populist influences in the States. I do not see that happening. The UK will be a member of CPTPP before the US.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think the Biden administration has a lot on its plate in the first couple of months, so it's going to be a challenge. I'm just going to see if I can return back to you, Amitendu, if you're able to comment. Yeah, I think unfortunately we'll have to come back to you, Amitendu, but we will have time to do that. Dan, did you have something quickly you wanted to mention on it?
Sure. While Amitan is getting his mic and gear, the one thing which has been very prominent in the U.S. discussion has been the fear about that the decoupling is actually de-Americanizing supply chains. And I think what we have to anticipate is that the lobbying effort from U.S. industry for the U.S. to re-engage will be very powerful on the Biden administration. And personally, I would think that this is a very good thing for Canada because we're better plugged into U.S. supply chain and can access the dynamic Asian markets through the U.S. more easily probably than we can directly. So I would just watch for that.
Okay, great. Amitendu.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, good. So Asia comes back. No, thank you, Jonathan. I was just trying to compliment you on bringing to the table a question which is really preoccupying the minds of a large number of people, not just in the region, but across the world, as I can see from the emphasis that you put to it. Look, I think let's look at it this way. We know that Mr. Biden personally and the Obama administration was exceptionally hardly committed to the TPPP, which it crafted during its time. But it was primarily looked at as an Asia-Pacific trade agreement. And for a large number of people in the region, the TPP was actually the stepping stone to an Asia-Pacific free trade agreement. Today, the context has changed somewhat. And that's primarily because not just the US moved out of the TPP, but also because in the meantime, the United States commitment and a large part of the regional commitment to the idea of Indo-Pacific has gained a lot of traction. I think a very central question to be looked at in that regard is that in terms of the Biden administration, how much is the resource that is willing to be committed to the idea of Indo-Pacific? Today, if the idea of Indo-Pacific supersedes that of the Asia-Pacific construct, I'm not entirely sure whether the US would want to come back to the CPTPP. Because I think the CPTPP by itself still remains primarily an Asia-Pacific trade construct. And today, there are other attendant complications that have come in. Firstly, China wants to join the CPTPP, which I think is a clever strategic move that China has played. And let's not forget that there is already a US-China trade deal which is in operation. That deal hasn't been taken away. Now, from a United States perspective, what are the benefits of getting into the CPTPP if it is not being positioned as an alliance to balance China? This is an important question which I think needs to be taken note of, because otherwise today, by and large, you have a real possibility if China joins the CPTPP, the RCEP and the CPTPP coming far closer to each other than we visualized it would earlier, because the memberships are going to very significantly overlap. In that case, for the United States, it's going to be a difficult choice. It's going to be an exceptionally difficult choice for India, because India is going to be the only important Indo-Pacific actor which will be left out of all formal trade constructs that are shaping up in Indo-Pacific and Asia-Pacific. In a sense, I think a country like India will be happy if the United States delays its decision on the CPTPP. And in the sense, it will give it more time to ponder, look at the ramifications, look at the implications. When it comes to the regional perspective, the ASEAN perspective, the broader Asia perspective, I think they will be happy to see the United States and China together in a trade agreement, because that trade agreement will be confidence inspiring. And the atmosphere in the region has been very heavily vitiated over the last 1 to 2 years over this, major friction that has broken out between the United States and China, because that's really economically affected Southeast Asia and a large number of other countries. But the point to be noted, Jonathan, is that, all these are afterthoughts. A lot has actually happened in the meantime. And I think this is where I want to come back to a point that Bert raised. I think we need to look very closely back at multilateralism. We need to look very closely back at the role that institutes like the ADB can play because of their politically neutral character. And same of the WTO. Well, I often hear this, that the WTO is bad, but I haven't got an answer in terms of what is better than the WTO. And when it comes to the ADB, let me give you a very simple example of what I say. You know that India and China have had a very ugly period of bilateral relations, leading India to suspend a large number of Chinese investments into India. About a month ago, India actually allowed a Chinese vendor investment in a road infrastructure project in India. And this was just because this was a project that was called out by the ADB. And the ADB project requires participation across nationalities, across countries. And when it is an ADB project, there is no concern. There is no concern with respect to what the country participation in that project is and how that can be utilized. A concern which I'm afraid continues to remain with the AIIB, continues to remain in a fairly substantive way, because there's always this view. India has held this view that, look, we are the largest shareholder, but China is the largest. And today you have a situation where there's a great amount of mistrust permeated in the region. And while countries are talking about working together, building collectives, so on and so forth, there needs to be a brand, there needs to be labels which inspire that confidence. And I think we really need to go back to the institutions which have pioneered that collectivity, WTO, ADB, APEC, to a very large extent, which came out of non-political neutral assignments. I'm not saying that you do away with Indo-Pacific. Indo-Pacific remains solid, but Indo-Pacific has to grow out of a largely security-shaped idea and construct.
Well, thanks, Amitendo. I think that's actually a really great segue to, I think, what'll make our last discussion, the moderated discussion, and then we'll kind of move in, because I really do want to get a chance to see and to provide some of the questions that our audience has. They had a number of interesting questions on this topic. But I think I did want to finalize the moderated discussion with a talk on security, because I think you really sort of crystallized that point there, that I think that many states, I think, are, when they're thinking about this region, I think Canada included, they see a host of different security tripwires, whether it's the Korean Peninsula, whether it's what's happening in the maritime domain in the East China Sea, the South China Sea, with regard to Taiwan. Obviously, Amitendo, you referenced what's happening between China and India, not to mention the persistent tensions between India and Pakistan. So there's a lot going on, obviously, from the security side. In addition to some of this, the worries about infrastructure as a part of the Belt and Road Initiative from China. So I guess my question would be, how do states sort of balance when they're developing these, Indo-Pacific concepts, Indo-Pacific approaches, looking for cooperation? How do they find the resources, the capital, and sort of that political attention to the economic and infrastructure trade side? It's no longer possible to sort of dissect these. I know people used to like to kind of bifurcate, economy, trade, and security, and say they're different baskets. I think we all know that that's no longer possible, and that they intersect quite closely. But how are we going to be able to kind of pursue some of these initiatives at the same time with these real principal and potential simmering security challenges in the region? So maybe I'll turn to Yuka first to see if she can kind of give me a perspective.
Right, thank you. That's a very important topic and important discussion, actually, around the free and open Indo-Pacific concept itself as well. I think one of the things that's often misunderstood about Japan's approach to Indo-Pacific is that because the idea of the security diamond that was proposed by Prime Minister Abe in his first term in 2007 the notion of the security, the ties of this Indo-Pacific security, was so strong that his new kind of diplomatic vision of free and open Indo-Pacific was also seen as more of a security construct. And I think another factor was that the Trump administration's national security strategy and also the DoD's defense strategy also used the term free and open Indo-Pacific, and that also gave more kind of security element to this construct. But if you actually look at what kind of things have emerged out of this free and open Indo-Pacific, it's really the economic dimension. I think some of the panelists have mentioned, but the real cooperation was seen around the economic pillar of this free and open Indo-Pacific. Like if you look at the actual statement between US and Japan on the shared vision of free and open Indo-Pacific, it's actually the economic vision around energy, digital connectivity, and infrastructure. And also, I think that one of the first speeches around the Indo-Pacific that came from the United States also was from the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, on the economic vision of FOIP. So I would say that FOIP is actually more of an economic vision, and which is tied with security and strategic purpose and concerns, but it's also, it's just the concept itself is supposed to be inclusive. Even Japan is expressing this inclusiveness and even saying that eventually China can join on this concept if it can confirm with the rules. It's more of this idea of trying to address these areas of governance gaps, and also the need for the development of multilateral trade agreements, and also a construct to keep the United States glued to the region under this construct. And by doing so, kind of push back on China's military and assertive activities in the region through a rules-based order. So I think probably push back a little bit on the security dimension of the.
Yeah, I'm going to move to. Thank you very much, Yuka, and I, fully agree with you. I think that this is sometimes, and often actually, a misperception of not just Japan's FOIP, but I think a lot of Indo-Pacific approaches writ large. And I think sometimes that narrative, I think, is pushed out because it's convenient for some countries that I think would like to sell the Indo-Pacific concept as a sort of a containment strategy against China. But as you said, Japan, and not only Japan, but I think a lot of other countries, when they look at this region, are very much focused on the economic leg, the trade leg, the infrastructure leg. So I think there's evolving approaches to this region, and security is an important point. I mean, I don't think any of us would deny that. But to say that that's the driver, I would also agree to kind of push back on that. Emitendu, I think you had a point.
Jonathan, I think one of the things that I wanted to come out of the question that you raised was how are actually countries trying to address the security dilemma, which is in a sense a part of their existence in the geography that they figure in. And let me try to respond to this query of yours by citing a couple of examples. I think this is something which is clearly dependent upon the size of the country and the amount of weightage it has in regional relations. If you look at countries like Sri Lanka and Maldives in the Indian Ocean, small countries, completely hemmed in by the rush of investments that they have been receiving from China. And it's been so overwhelming that they are really not in a position to make choices, because for them, it's kind of a quid pro quo right from the beginning. But if you shift this narrative further eastward and you look at a country like Indonesia, for example, well, Indonesia has also been caught in the middle, forced in a position to make choices, but because of its size and the weightage that it has in the regional affairs, it still has a certain degree of flexibility. It can afford to make that choice on a case-by-case basis. So I think as we go ahead in the Indo-Pacific, this is a pattern which is going to emerge. Middle powers, bigger powers, powers with more capacity and institutions will be in a better position to hedge, will be in a better positions to decisively drive trade and economic relations with multiple engagements with major powers. But when it comes to the smaller powers, we will see more and more of them taking sides or being forced to take sides. And that's where I go back to my earlier iteration. A forum like the WTO, a forum like the ADB, or institutions like World Bank, they remain absolutely vital.
Okay, that's great, Emitendu. Dan, please, quite briefly, if you can, because I would like to get to the audience questions after this. Sorry, you're on mute, Dan.
One of the things that I think hasn't been mentioned is the idea of balancing. And balancing does actually mean balancing. So you may wish to both partner economically and balance against insecurity spheres. And so the choice is not necessarily either or, but in terms of entirely, but in terms of in which sector. And I guess the other thing which is really important is that as we've moved into the new digital age, the concept of national security exceptions, which is in the WTO agreement, which is geared towards nuclear war, active war, emergencies, that language no longer works. We have the cybersecurity risks are continual, and they're also oftentimes of a much smaller nature. So we have to actually figure out how to craft a security exception that allows trade to go on. So that, I think, is the critical factor there.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, I mean, this was a great round of insights. I think we could have kind of gone on for a while. There's a lot of other questions actually on my mind that we'll have to save table for the next discussion. But I did want to get to the audience questions, and there's a number of them, and we have a limited amount of time here, so I'm going to kind of again do the sort of not nice thing as a moderator and sort of bundle some of these questions together and make you do extra work and try to answer multiple questions at the same time. But I think the majority of the questions of our audience sort of focus on Canada's role and how Canada could kind of intersect on some of the issues that you've discussed today. So just a few of the points that I think I'd be interested in getting your thoughts on. And you don't have to feel that you need to answer everyone, but ones that might be relevant to your expertise. The first kind of question comes in about how Canada might want to work with foreign-looking small and medium-sized enterprises, and kind of of course we have a relationship with the United States, which is our #1 trading partner. But how might we try to promote more engagement with some of the economies in the Indo-Pacific, especially some of those economies in ASEAN and some of the Northeast Asian countries outside of China? Again, not to exclude China from this, but I think we're looking for a little bit more sort of creative discussion on where we could be pushing some of these SMEs. So that would be one question that I would ask. And the second one, which I hear many times, and I think I've heard this on the security side, but more broadly as Canada looks to engage in this region, and this is maybe a tough question for those who have not focused as much attention, but as a middle power, how, from a resource perspective, is Canada, supposed to look at operating in this region from a trade and infrastructure perspective? Is this something? It's obviously something that we are playing a role in, and we can continue to play a role in. But how big can that role be, and what costs with regard to our engagements in other regions? So I would start with those two questions if anybody has thoughts. Just raise, maybe Dan, actually. I will start with you first, if that's okay.
Okay, I don't mind. I guess in terms of, as I mentioned in my own initial presentation, Canada does not have a lot of capability right now in building the hardware of the new economy, but we do have a lot of capability in the software side. And as the new networks are being developed, 5G, a lot of the network actually is software. So Canada can participate best, I think, in this new emerging economy, and with minimizing the problems of distance. So this can be including for Southeast Asia and elsewhere as an economy that has got a lot of trust globally with all partners. We can leverage that to penetrate the new economy. So I'll leave it at that, and perhaps others can weigh in on this.
Thanks very much, Dan. Any others with quick thoughts? Mitendu.
I'd respond to both questions, Jonathan. The first is the SME question. Well, trade agreements continue to remain the best way to move forward. But these trade agreements need to be those which, and I'm talking about a Canadian perspective here, which actually have very specific provisions on investment. Because these need to be agreements through which there is a possibility of Canadian investments moving into sectors where the Canadian SMEs can have an opportunity to participate. So there's no point in looking at shallow agreements or simply preferential agreements which focus just on tariff concessions. They have to be much broader, wider, more specific. The second question, Jonathan, whether Canada has the resources. Well, I think practically no country in the world today has the resources to match up to China in the Indo-Pacific. The answer to that, the solution to that, is to work together. I think that is something which has already been provided an answer to. Japan has been working with India and Australia. There are a number of other countries which are joining the initiative. We have the group of 10 democracies. I think Canada is perfectly positioned to actually work together with other middle powers in the Indo-Pacific to match up to China. That could be as blunt and candid as I could be.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I might just kind of add on to that kind of question. And I think this was another one of our audience's questions, is sort of the evolution of how we would, in an institutional sense, kind of work together with like-minded partners, whether that be through the group of democracies, a D10 sort of concept, or whether that be through kind of the traditional institutions that we're already engaged in, such as the G7. So again, I don't know if Bart, Yuka, if you had any thoughts on this these last couple points before we conclude.
Yuka?
No pressure, but.
Okay, I'll make some short comments around D10. I think since also the fact that I'm based in London usually. So there has been a lot of discussions around the D10, democracy 10 countries, and the invitations of India, Australia, South Korea. But it seems from my perspective that there hasn't been much momentum in discussions from these countries that are invited, or around Japan or even the United States, or if the D10 is actually the best framework to work together. And if I remember correctly, I think this was focused on the cooperation on 5G. But I think the D10 hasn't been really the central institution yet in terms of technology cooperation. And I think there's more discussions around you shouldn't just limit one single institution in terms of digital cooperation, but there's lots of different kinds of digital technologies and aspects, like Dan mentioned, the software side or the hardware side, and I'm hearing increasing thoughts and opinions from stakeholders that maybe ad hoc approach on cooperation is more suited for these kind of cooperation.
Yeah, well, I tend to agree with you. I mean, I think the last thing we want to do is add another layer of bureaucracy to this that may not be effective. I think it may be a forum to kind of trade ideas, but as you said, whether it is the forum in an exclusive sense, I think is still an open question. Bart, did you have anything you wanted to add at all?
Yes, indeed. First of all, the comments, these most recent set of comments from my fellow panelists, spot on. Agree with all of those incisive observations. I would just add, and coming back to what Emetendu was talking about in terms of the role of the MDBs, they're multifaceted role, including as a nonpartisan, if you will, convener. Looking at the commercial opportunities for consulting and procurement contracts. In some cases, we're talking very big projects where Canadian firms aren't well situated to win, for example, a big procurement contract. But some of the smaller enterprises in Canada could sign on and collaborate with other companies, larger firms, as a sub to a major bidder on a procurement or consulting contract. And that happens to a certain degree now, but I think that there's more space for that to happen. The other thing too, in terms of market access, Canada needs further agreements with some of the countries. It doesn't have an agreement with ASEAN, doesn't have an agreement with China, India. It needs to keep working on market access and agreements. And as these are negotiated, like the one that's underway now with Indonesia, it's not just the fancy signing ceremony, and we give a lot of attention to that. There has to be a concerted effort right from the get-go to link that to practical application, in terms of promotion and empowering both small and medium as well as large enterprises to take advantage of the new provisions of those agreements. So linking more closely the negotiating part and all the fanfare around that to the actual connecting Canadian firms with the new opportunities that they have in the region.
Well, thanks very much, Bart. And I think your last point really hits home strongly. And I think this has been something I've been arguing is that, I do think in some sectors there seems to be this sense that after joining TPP 11, that this may be sort of, we're past the finish line, and we've got this gold standard agreement in the region. But as you said, those agreements are only as good as they're implemented, only as good as they're informed with in line with the private sector, and kind of find those opportunities and work together with the private sector in order to take advantage of that sort of comparative advantage that we have because of that agreement. So I think that's a really, really important point. And this segues very well. So, thank you first and foremost to my fellow panelists, who I think we had a set of great remarks and really helped us understand this issue more, and builds on our first session, which was more focused on security. And I think will lead very well and very nicely to a session we're going to have in a couple of weeks, which will tackle the broader issue that I think we teased on and touched on, which is Canada and the Indo-Pacific, and how we should precisely be looking at all of these different issues from an infrastructure, a trade side, but also a security side. So I want to thank everyone for the great remarks, and also for the audience for tuning in. Thank you so much. Good night, and good morning, I guess, to some of you, and enjoy a nice cup of coffee. But thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you.